I work for HOK. It's an architecture firm north of 1,600 people. We have about 24 offices. We also do engineering, planning, and pretty much everything. We're just an AE, not an EA sort of firm. I had a profile that never got uploaded fast enough, but I like cats, and I sort of think of the internet as the database of cats. I like it a lot. And I was a future thinker 6 years ago. I bought this web address. You'll find nothing on it, but just think of the ramifications of the second afterlife. So you can go from there. Okay, so the title of my deck, just before I get into things, which is actually pretty, as Dale told me just about an hour ago, is actually pretty, there's a word I'm looking for, but it has to do with an intersection of things that are interesting. Serendipitous, there we go. So this YouTube clip, I won't play it now, we can maybe play it at the end. It's from a translation of a game called Zero Wing, and you just saw today that Elon Musk tweeted this out about their patents. Thanks, Dale, for pointing me out to this. Same reference, all our patents belong to you is the same play on words, so that now you're in on the little joke. There's a wiki site here, and this friend of mine is the one that actually turned me onto this. His Twitter handle is all your base belong to me, so go from there. Okay, so what do I do at HOK? I'm an architect. I'm at Technologies. That's pretty interesting. I'm some sort of future person you haven't met yet. When I started into this process, I knew Latin lawn, and there were other things called coordinate systems, and you name it. I knew about it. That's about it. I work with about 40 groups within HOK. It's a pretty mixed bag, from interiors to urban designers, structural engineers, just a lot of stuff. And then anything from databases to city models to structural engineers sort of thing. So where we started this whole process of actually knowing about or using FME is we needed a better workflow for a planning project, and we started using FME really about a year ago. So I mentioned in the intro that I'm going to mention these crazy convoluted workflows. The first one I'm going to show, or the last one I'm going to show first in the list here, which is I swapped it around. The enterprise data management piece is really the piece that's ever evolving, and I'll get to that at the end. And then there's some other elements in here we'll address. So where we started was here. We were doing a new city roughly for about the population the size of Rome, and it's about 130 square miles. Sorry, I'm from the States, so I say miles. I can't convert that to hectares or kilometers, but it's big. And somebody agreed to the fact that we'd model everything. I mean, buildings for that, it's well over 2 million buildings that we would essentially have hand modeled was the idea. So our workflow had been, we were using a smart code system. What you're seeing on screen would have been something done out of Revit, that we would do a little, sort of area, mass it up. This is then indicative of the whole thing. Well, that was all hand modeled. It wasn't very, sort of great workflow, especially if we had to model everything. So we actually have a sort of unique workflow, being that our urban planners work in an architecture firm. We use a lot of Revit. They use Revit like a hacked together GIS tool. So they do all their 2D land use planning in Revit as huge rooms, which is really odd, but nothing to do with GIS. It doesn't even know where it's on Earth. But at the end of the day, it looks like a themed map, and we can put them in books and stuff like that. So the workflow we actually worked through was Revit land use planning to city engine massing, and all of that then got into InfoWorks, so it's like every product you could think of. We used this transect methodology that I mentioned. Really, the workflow looked like this. So we would start in Revit, go into FME, go into city engine for 2 pieces of data, both center lines and plots. And then also we would render out geotiffs from hatches and AutoCAD to make an image background to actually drive the land use planning. And then we'd use Civil 3D back into FME, and then also ultimately everything went back through FME into InfoWorks. So you ask why that we did it that way. Well, InfoWorks is the only thing we could show someone a city this big. City Engine was the only place we could sort of programmatically develop all the buildings based on actual use, and Revit is where we actually did the planning. And then our engineers that were doing road center lines were working in Civil 3D and developing the topo surfaces. This is a slightly modified version of the same thing that we're using on our next project, just more, slight variation on the inputs. I'm sure City Engine will come into play here, but now we're just saying we're going to go out to ArcGIS Online for publishing some data as well. So this is the sort of Revit, and there's some animations here I always forget about. So Revit rooms as hatches to AutoCAD into FME to develop the plots. And you can see here we get like sort of an image-based background that comes out of that. That's actually the sort of driver we use in City Engine. And you know, in AutoCAD it was, well, out of Revit into AutoCAD it was just hatches. So we just basically gave them a tonal value from 0 to 1 in a grayscale, and that's actually how we mapped what in Revit land use was to how the City Engine, sort of how City Engine would manipulate the buildings and apply the appropriate City Engine rules on top of it. Then we did the same thing for center lines. This was probably, if you know Revit, these were room separation lines as street center lines. So very odd workflow, but ultimately we were able to put it together into a workflow. Now the important thing to know is really 2 people in this project, this example, worked outside of Revit. One person, well, the same person, Chris, making the City Engine workflow, learning City Engine all at the same time as learning FME, and putting together the workflow, and everybody else just worked in Revit, and then they did modifications and stuff like that to the rules to develop the content as it came out of City Engine. So once we were in City Engine, we used 3DS. There's some limitations on the coordinate system support and the version of City Engine we were using, so this place we couldn't go back through a file geodatabase directly into FME, so we had to go out through a 3DS file. But all things being equal, we were able to do that. And then these land use plans that we were developing, which basically, so in Revit, once you have a room, you can essentially theme them in multiple views. So we were developing a series of properties on those rooms, and those were just being dumped out as separate shape files for different land use types, or variations of shape files for different layer sets, basically. And we were merging and combining them. So that's the sort of the brunt of us getting started to use FME. Once we got this process down, we brought in FME Server. We had, at this point, we only have 2 licenses of desktop, which we're starting to grow. By the end of the project, we were able to have the team simply upload the content to the server. These transforms were done, and as long as we didn't have much QA in the definitions, but as long as they were named correctly and layers were right, works just fine. And then we'd pass it on to the next step. So it was Revit out, do some work, City Engine out, into InfraWorks. So I'll just back up because there's a slide I missed, or not missed, but just a sort of overview here. So this is the view at City Engine. I guess I'm not including a very good, unfortunately I can't tell you what the project is, so I don't have any good overall data, but the actual site is about 100 kilometers long and whatever wide in its various width and stuff like that. So that's where we started. Now, as soon as we had City Engine in, or not City Engine, I'm sorry, FME in-house, we were sort of confronted by the fact that our industry, AEC particularly, is not very automated at doing anything. So we started looking at all kinds of different workflows. We have a few database tools that we use connected to Revit. And so there's a list here, but I'll sort of just go through them so we can get through it by the end of the session and hopefully get some questions in. So we use a Postgres database program management tool, so basically building programs, the space is this big. We had a need for someone to walk a site, evaluate an existing facility, and then get that information back to Revit. Pretty straightforward. There aren't really custom tools or tools built specifically for that. It's a very small niche. So we ended up hooking the Derofus database up to a Google spreadsheet. You walk the site in a filling out the data in Google spreadsheet, sync it back through FME Server, back to Derofus, and then Derofus syncs with Revit. So that's a first extra workflow we did. This one we're actually trying to work through right now. Revit and rooms in general on projects aren't network-based, but they represent a network. So we're trying to figure out how to come up with a sort of ability to do root analysis with FME on this sort of a grid-based approach. We haven't spent much time on it. I'm sure someone could come up with something based on previous experience, but thus far this is one of the other things we're working on. We have set up 3D and 2D drawing and model compare workflows. So basically this runs on the server. You submit a set of drawings in DWG or DFX, and then we do also have the same thing set up for model compare. Basically just two versions of IFC files or DWGs in some cases, I think is what we've done. The key thing here is this is us, finding a tool that does all kinds of things that we can't automate mostly at all, because Revit's sort of a brick when it comes to automation, not automation. I just invented a word. But so these are the sort of things that fall out of that process. We're exploring RVZ. So RVZ is the new file format that the guys at SAFE have developed through a Revit plugin that packages up an IFC and data, and then you can use it directly in FME. And we're looking at methodology to come up with any sort of versioning so we can compare across versions easier. There are a few tools like an IFC server that we might look at do this too, but this is, hey, we can do it, we'll try it and figure out if it works. When we start to talk about the enterprise data management piece, all of the things that you saw there, we would like to sort of, every time we do them, there's data in those models that if we're going to process them, we want to extract some data out of them. I mean, I'm working on a request right now that we have 1,000 financial projects, small projects, probably done in Revit, that we want to extract just how many offices were in them. But right now, the process is to open an individual Revit file, and if you're lucky, they're modeled the same way, and then we'll sort of count them. What we're really trying to be able to do is set up a process that we can monitor a project, see that it's progressing and being modeled the right way, and obviously we could do this with an export process into FME in a sort of reporting mechanism, and at the same time capturing that data. And now I know of the 1,000 projects, I can ask the question how many offices we did. Quite hard to answer right now. It's done with AutoCAD P-lines and a lot of interns at this point. A lot of is how this works. So the one thing that's actually automated that we built ourselves is we actually capture every time someone syncs to Central in Revit. We built a tool that basically does this, and we started capturing, we know their office location, but we also actually start to capture the actual lat lawn specified on the Revit file. I mentioned, or I breezed by it, but architects don't necessarily know buildings go on Earth. We found a lot of our projects were in Boston. If you know, Revit defaults the location of a Revit file to Boston. We have vast majority of projects are in Waltham, Massachusetts. So apparently not everybody's adjusting this data, even if they're doing shadow studies or those sorts of things, which is a bit scary. So in this case, what we're actually doing is every time someone syncs, we write that data into a Microsoft SQL database, and this is just a, basically super simple transformer that we sort of collect that data. I do some, I'm trying to remember how to do this. I think this is a fusion table, so basically I'm just giving it a city that's properly formed out of the location data from our, abbreviated city names for people's locations. Self-serve anything. I mean, this is sort of where we're trying to go with, just file conversions. Like this happens to be rooms out of SketchUp. There's often needs, for people to color these things and make pretty diagrams. It shouldn't be something that takes someone 5, 6 steps to do, and they have to reinvent the process every time. So when it comes to the automation, we're definitely looking at the RTV, and we're actually just starting to implement RTV Tools, which is a New Zealand company that Dale and others have started to work with. And really what that does is allow us to schedule a batching process. Not perfect, Revit doesn't make that easy to get past user warnings and stuff like that, but it's pretty close in a large number of projects to be able to do that. And then, like I said, to sort of create a pre-compiled data set that we can do these multi-project analyses as this happen. And so, I mean, from a server standpoint, we just, it's surprising that, you know, in the GIS and geospatial space, how much of this stuff has been taken care of so long ago that you can do things, not necessarily a batch way, but there's a sort of a way of compiling and bringing this data together. There's definitely not in our sort of main business. So we're really trying to, you know, sort of start to introduce these things from various, you know, some various workflows. So there's tons of opportunities. I'm not shy of asking you for things thus far, but like I said, it's pretty untapped when it comes to actually automating anything in this industry. Like I said, apparently buildings are on Earth, which is a surprise to some people apparently. And there's a whole series of quality control, rule checking, you name it, of sort of scenarios where you could come up with is as soon as you have something that you can read dynamically across multiple projects, you can start to build on top of. Some of the challenges, we're certainly asking for formats all the time. IFC, the sort of the main, most intelligent format, can be pretty clumsy, and a big IFC file in FME still, you know, still hard to churn through sometimes, but it's certainly possible. And I think that's it. So I think I got about 2 or 3, maybe less. So like I said, this is me. Certainly email me if you have any questions that come up later, but anybody have any questions now?
Pass the mic around if anyone has a question.
Could you give me an idea of the difference between City Engine and the Rhino? Could you give me an idea between the differences between City Engine and the Rhino software that you mentioned?
So Rhino is not procedural. What's the best way to put it? Well, it's a, I don't know. Well, it's a hand modeler, so you model things by hand. It's pretty robust geometry capabilities. People use it with Grasshopper, so that you might see some Grasshopper scripts or Grasshopper definitions that do a little sort of urban planning. You probably will run across those. City Engine is a shape grammar tool, so it's actually a CGA shape is the sort of procedural language it uses. So you're very rarely actually specifically modeling anything. You're just developing the rule set and then giving it the resource that it needs to apply the rule, and you get an indicative building. You don't get a design building out of the process. Any other questions? Right here.
With the Revit model, you said standards, like certain offices or certain people working on the Revit models have like different schemas or layouts.
So the question is about standards in the Revit models. What we'll find is that the base set of data is, you know, people use rooms and they have the name in the right spot. What we'll find is there's various ways to actually model something in Revit. The rooms aren't the problem. It's more like curtain wall looks like one thing, or it's sort of built in a unique way because of the geometry. So those are the bigger challenges. So it's just the multitude of ways of handling the different sort of methods, not necessarily the properties. And if we want an extended property set that's unique to us, that's when it would become harder to manage and check.
I'm just wondering what drove the decision to use Revit to do the land use stuff instead of Civil 3D?
Well, so we're an architecture firm. We use Revit for nearly everything. So we have expertise there, and frankly, I find it much easier to use than Civil 3D because we can do. People can argue this. I'm not saying that it is the case, but it does give you a lot of intelligence, because the main reason we were doing it, because we used to have an AutoCAD-based workflow that required an export to calculate. Revit does do real-time calculations on FAR and all these other things. That was really the driver of doing it there, but not in the GIS tool, because none of these people wanted to use GIS tools.
I was just wondering why you go to a city engine. Doesn't InfraWorks also have procedural modeling capabilities? InfraWorks will only do extruded heights, so 2.5D sort of stuff. You can't tell it to do something different than that. Any further questions? Yes.
Where was the new city you were modeling?
Can't tell you.
Boston, right?
Yeah, apparently.
You asked about routing stuff. Your neighbor in Boston, appropriately enough, University of Massachusetts, Amherst, which is somewhere there, has done some work on integrating some kind of Python routing stuff into FME workflows for the kind of thing you're doing. So I may need to introduce you to Alexander. If you don't know Alexander Stepanov, or Sasha as he calls himself, I think there's a collaboration to be had there.
Okay, perfect.
Any other questions? Nope. Great, thank you very much.